I was 80 years old, sitting at my desk in the spare room with my reading glasses on and a cup of coffee going cold beside the keyboard, when the Facebook notification came through from a woman named Paulette Sims. Not a close friend, just someone from my church's online group who had apparently been sitting with a piece of information for several days and finally decided someone ought to say something. Her message was short. She wrote that she didn't know how to bring this up properly, but that something had been circulating about me and she thought I deserved to know. Attached below her words was my own obituary, my name at the top, my photograph, the Christmas one from 4 years ago, the red cardigan, the pearls, a date of death listed as 11 days prior. I have always known how to read a document. I sat with my hands flat on the desk and read it straight through, the way I used to read a filing I expected to be fraudulent, looking at the language, the structure, the things that were present, and the things that were notably absent. Then I read it again. The photograph was one Pamela had taken. The language sounded like someone who didn't know me well had been given a few facts and asked to do their best. The survivors listed were Pamela, her husband Douglas, their 2 children. Vernon was not listed. There was no mention of a service, no funeral home, no instructions for flowers or donations, because there was no service. Because the obituary was not for burying me. It was for moving things. I did not call Pamela. I went to the closet, took out a manila folder, and wrote my own name on the tab in my clerk's block letters. Hello, friends. I need to say this plainly. Someone sat down, chose a photograph of their living mother, typed a date of death, and sent it out to family and neighbors. While that woman was drinking her morning coffee on Oleander Street. If this channel is new to you, stay. Subscribe. You'll want to hear what Nadine did next. The spare room had been my home office since before I retired, and after retirement, it stayed more or less the same. The gray metal desk I'd brought home from the county when they replaced the furniture in 2007, the filing cabinet in the corner, the shelves with the procedure manuals I'd kept out of habit, and the 2 or 3 county history books that had accumulated over 34 years. The window looked out on the side yard, where I grew tomatoes. In the summer, in 3 big clay pots that had been there so long, the bottoms were permanently stained with rust from the clay leaching into the concrete. I spent a great deal of my retirement in that room. It was comfortable in the way that a workplace becomes comfortable when you have spent enough years in it. Not luxurious, just familiar. Every object in a location that made sense. I have always known how to read a document. That is not a boast. It is simply what 34 years of processing other people's paperwork produces in a person. I knew what a death certificate required and what it generated downstream. I knew which probate filings needed a certified copy of the death certificate and which could proceed on a notarized affidavit. I knew what a fraudulent filing looked like. The language slightly off, the supporting documentation incomplete, the timing a little too convenient. I had flagged those across my career without drama, because drama was not the appropriate response. You note what is irregular. You document it. You follow the proper procedure for correction. That is how the system functions when people use it correctly, and it is also how the system corrects itself when people don't. The obituary Pamela had circulated was not a particularly sophisticated document. That was perhaps the thing that struck me most on the second reading. She had access to good information. She knew my full name, my date of birth, my profession, the year I'd retired. She had a decent photograph. But the language was bland in a way that told me clearly it hadn't been written by anyone who actually knew me. And the structural gaps, no service, no funeral home, no charitable donation request, were the kind of gaps that a person produces when they are focused on what a document needs to accomplish, rather than on what it needs to look like. She had been thinking about the downstream filings. She had not been thinking carefully enough about whether the obituary itself would hold up to a close reading. I had spent 34 years teaching myself to notice exactly that kind of gap. I found the manila folder in the closet and wrote Nadine Brewer on the tab in my block clerk's letters. The same handwriting I had used for 34 years on folders that passed through official county channels. I took the obituary off the screen and printed it. 6 pages including the photograph, which the printer rendered in acceptable grayscale, and paperclipped it inside the folder. Then I sat at the desk with the folder in front of me and thought about the 7 months of silence from Pamela, which I had been treating as a cooling-off period after our disagreement about the estate, and thought carefully about what that silence had actually been. 7 months? She had been quiet for 7 months, and I had given her the time, and she had used the time. I had assumed she was managing her feelings about our disagreement. She had been managing something else entirely. The coffee was completely cold by then. I poured it out and made a fresh cup, and came back to the desk and began to make a list of every person who might have received word of my death, working through it the same way I used to reconstruct a document trail, starting with what I knew for certain and working outward toward the probable and the possible. Paulette Sims had been specific. Word had gone through the church group. That meant the pastor, at minimum, and likely several of the regular members. Darnell's family in Valdosta, his sister May, his cousin Terrell in Columbus. Those were people Pamela had always maintained a cordial relationship with, the kind of relationship that would have made them natural recipients of a death notice. Old neighbors. Colleagues from the county who might still follow my name out of habit. I wrote names in the folder. I made the list long and I made it careful, because a careful list is the beginning of a proper record, and a proper record is the only thing that stands up when someone decides to use paperwork against you. The disagreement with Pamela had been about the estate, which is to say, it had been about the land and the account, which is to say, it had been about money in the way that family disagreements about estates always are. Not only about money, and not admitted to be about money, but organized around it the way a house is organized around its foundation. Darnell died 11 years ago from a slow cancer that gave us 10 months to prepare. We prepared carefully. I had spent 3 decades watching what happened to people who did not prepare carefully, and I was not going to leave that kind of wreckage behind. The house on Oleander Street went into my name alone. Beneficiary designations were updated and confirmed. His will was clean and specific. But there were things that stayed loose at the edges, as there always are. Not because we had been careless, but because some things are genuinely difficult to settle while a person is still dying, and some things feel less urgent than they actually are until they become urgent. The 4.3 acres in Bibb County had been Darnell's purchase in 1987, a piece of land he'd bought from a retiring farmer for reasons that were clearer to him at the time than they ever fully became to me. He talked about building something on it someday. He talked about leaving it to the children. He died with it still in his name, with transfer on death language pointing to me, and then to Vernon and Pamela in equal shares. The county assessed it at around $67,000, which was not a fortune, but was not nothing. The joint savings account held $24,000, money we had set aside over years for no particular purpose except the general purpose of having something. Pamela had opinions about both of these things. She wanted the land listed and sold, settled, proceeds divided, done. She felt the account needed to be formally transferred. She mentioned once that Douglas's family had some interest in Bibb County property. She said it once and did not repeat it, which was the right instinct, because I noticed it the way I noticed overreaching language in a probate filing. I told her I was not ready to settle the land question. I told her the account was properly designated and did not require her intervention. She said carefully that she felt things needed to move forward. I said they would move forward on my schedule. That was March. She stopped calling in April, and by May, I had decided she needed time to accept that she was not going to manage this process on her preferred timeline. I gave her the spring. I gave her the summer. By fall, I was thinking I should reach out, but I thought, she is 54 years old, not a child. She knows where I live. She knows my number. I let the fall pass. 11 days before Paulette Sims sent me the message, Pamela had apparently decided that my schedule was no longer the relevant one. I thought about the Christmas cards she sent every year, the ones with the color-coordinated family photograph, Douglas and Pamela and the 2 grandchildren, arranged on the front porch of their Augusta house in matching burgundy and cream. She had been sending those cards for 20 years. She managed appearances with a precision I had always quietly respected, even when I found it slightly excessive. It required effort to maintain that level of coordination across 20 years of Christmas cards. It required effort to write an obituary for a living person and distribute it to their family and friends and church community, and then wait 11 days while the downstream documents were initiated. Both of those things required the same underlying quality, a willingness to manage the presentation of a situation rather than the situation itself. I had known that about Pamela for a long time. I had not known she would aim it in this direction. I called Leonard Causey at 9:47 in the morning, which I know because I wrote it in the folder before I dialed. Leonard has handled my affairs for 16 years, estate work, the property questions that came up after Darnell died, the occasional letter that needed to carry legal weight without announcing itself as a threat. He is a methodical man, which is what I need from an attorney. I do not need someone to commiserate with me. I need someone who will do what they said they would do on the timeline they said they would do it. He answered on the second ring. I said I needed him to listen to something, and I read him the obituary. All of it. Straight through, the language about my devoted years of service to the community, the date of death, the list of survivors that included Pamela and Douglas and their children, and did not include Vernon, the phrase about the family's wish for privacy in this time of grief. I read him my name at the top. I read him the date. There were 4 seconds of silence on the line. I counted them. In my experience, 4 seconds of silence from Leonard Causey means he is deciding whether what he just heard is as serious as it appears to be. His conclusion in this case took exactly 4 seconds. Don't touch anything, he said. Don't call Pamela. Don't reach out to anyone in that family. Do you still have the original message with the attachment? I told him I had the original message, the printed obituary, and Paulette Sims's contact information. Keep all of it. I'm going to make some calls. I'll get back to you within the hour. He paused. Do you understand what this may be about? Legally? I processed probate filings for 34 years, I said. I understand exactly what it's about. A brief pause. Then you know what to look for in the county records. I already know what to look for. I need you to find out what's already been filed. He called back in 52 minutes. He had found something on the first or second call and had not needed to go further. He did not give me the full picture on that first call back. He needed more time to pull everything. But he told me enough to confirm what I already suspected. The obituary had not been an act of cruelty for its own sake. It had been a first document in a sequence. Something had moved. Something had been filed in my name that I had not signed. I added the time of the call to the folder, Leonard's name, and the phrase, initiated inquiry. confirmed irregular filings. Then I clipped that page behind the printed obituary, and in front of the space I had left for what would come next. This is how you build a record. You start at the beginning. You write down what you know and when you knew it, and you do not leave gaps. You do not editorialize, and you do not omit things because they are uncomfortable. You write down what happened in order, and you date every entry, and you make sure the folder closes correctly with everything inside it. I had built records like this for 34 years on behalf of the county. I knew every step. The difference this time was that the subject of the record was my own name and my own life, and the irregularity I was documenting was not a stranger's overreach, but my daughter's. I sat with that for a moment. Not with grief exactly, though the grief was somewhere underneath it, would be there for a long time. And then I put the folder in order and went to make a fresh cup of coffee. Outside on Oleander Street, a car went by slowly. The Crittenden Hayes boy from 2 houses down, the one who had just gotten his license and drove with the careful terror of someone who understood what the vehicle could do and was not yet sure he could manage it. I watched it pass from the window. Then I turned back to the desk and began the next page. The hardest call was to Odessa. I sat at the kitchen table for nearly 15 minutes before I dialed her number. Not because I was afraid of the call exactly, but because I needed to be prepared for what I might find on the other end of it. Odessa Kimball has been my closest friend since 1971. We met at Second Baptist when we were both young women. She was newly married to Harold, and I was newly married to Darnell, and we had been in each other's lives for more than 50 years, in the way that a certain kind of friendship becomes so built into your daily existence that you stop noticing it as something you maintain, the way you stop noticing the weight-bearing walls in a house you've lived in for decades. If word had gone through the church group, Odessa had received it. That was a certainty, not a possibility. What I did not know was how long she had been carrying it. She answered on the first ring, which is unusual for Odessa, who is generally leisurely about the telephone. "Odessa," I said. What happened next is difficult to describe with precision. It was not a scream, and it was not a sob. It was something prior to both of those. The sound a body makes when something it understood to be settled suddenly is not, before the mind has had time to catch up and decide what the correct response is. Then she said my name. "Nadine?" And then again, "Nadine?" And a third time, each repetition sounding less like a question and more like a test of whether saying the word would confirm something she was afraid to confirm. "I'm here," I said. "I'm on Oleander Street. I'm at my kitchen table." She started to cry then, and I let her. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I slid off the kitchen chair and sat down on the linoleum floor with my back against the cabinet under the sink. The way you sit when you need to feel something solid under you. She had been told 11 days ago. She had rearranged a trip to visit her daughter in Savannah, had called and explained why, and her daughter had cried on the phone. She had told her grandchildren. She had gone through the private, specific grief of losing someone who has been present in your life for 53 years, the grief that floods you with all of it at once, every memory arriving simultaneously, because the mind, faced with permanent absence, tries to hold everything before it slips away. She had done all of that, quietly and alone, for 9 days, before Paulette Sims's uncertainty began to spread and someone started asking questions. 9 days. I stayed on the kitchen floor for a long time after the call ended. The refrigerator hummed. A mockingbird outside worked through its full repertoire, It had taken up residence in the crepe myrtle by the back fence that spring and had not been particularly considerate about the hours it kept. I sat there with the phone against my chest and thought about Pamela. I thought about the Christmas cards with the coordinated photographs. I thought about the specific calculation it had taken, choosing the right photograph, writing language careful enough to sound believable, deciding whom to notify and in what order, waiting 11 days before initiating the paperwork so that the death would have time to settle into people's understanding before the documents began to move. I tried to find the place in myself where this was incomprehensible. I could not find it. I had spent 34 years watching what people were willing to file when they wanted something badly enough, and what Pamela had done was a version of something I had seen before, smaller and uglier and much more personal, but recognizable. That was its own kind of terrible. Not that my daughter had done something monstrous, that she had done something I recognized. 9 full days. Odessa rearranged a trip to Savannah, told her grandchildren, grieved, because Pamela needed those documents to move. I have to ask you plainly, if Nadine had been your mother, what would you have done when you found out? Leonard called again the following morning at 8:15. He had pulled the county records. His paralegal had run the search the previous afternoon, and there were 2 filings that should not have existed. The first was a petition to the Bibb County Probate Court regarding the 4.3 acres. It had been filed using an affidavit attesting to my death, with the circulated obituary submitted as supporting documentation. Leonard told me the filing was dated 9 days after the date of death listed in the obituary, which meant someone had given it time to settle, had allowed the notification to circulate, waited for the plausible window to pass, then taken it to the courthouse. The petition sought to initiate the transfer process for the land. The attorney of record was a firm in Augusta I did not recognize. The second was a written inquiry to the bank regarding the joint savings account. A letter on professional letterhead, citing the obituary and requesting confirmation of account status and transfer procedures upon the death of a joint account holder. The bank had not yet acted on it. Banks process these things slowly. That was the only piece of luck in this entire situation, and it was luck that had a narrow window attached to it. How much has actually moved? I asked. Nothing final, Leonard said. The probate petition was just initiated. The bank inquiry is unprocessed. You caught it in the window. I caught it because Paulette Sims was paying attention, and because I called you the same day. Yes, both of those things matter. I knew to call him the same day because I had read the obituary the way I read a fraudulent probate filing, looking not at what it stated, but at what it was designed to cause downstream. That is the thing that 34 years of records work produces in a person. You stop reading documents for what they announce and start reading them for what they initiate. The obituary was not a statement about my death. It was the opening document in a sequence, and I had read it as such within an hour of receiving it. Leonard said he would file a formal objection to the probate petition immediately and notify the bank in writing that no transfer of any kind was to be processed without my personal verification, presented in person with current valid identification. He would also draft a letter to the Augusta firm. He said the phrase, fraudulent misrepresentation to a court of law, would appear in that letter more than once, which was, in his understated way, about as close to indignation as Leonard Causey typically got. I added the details to the folder. 2 new pages, dated and clipped in order, behind the call log from the previous morning. The folder was getting weight to it. The specific, satisfying weight of a record being built correctly, one dated entry at a time, nothing missing, nothing out of sequence. I went back to the kitchen and made a second cup of coffee and stood at the window while it brewed and looked at the yard. The tomato plants needed water. It had been warm all week, and I had been distracted. I went out with the watering can and watered them, and the morning smelled like warm clay and the cut grass from Mr. Crittenden Hayes mowing the evening before, and it was a perfectly ordinary Thursday morning on Oleander Street, and I was alive, and I had a folder and a very capable attorney, and the paperwork was going to be corrected. I thought about Vernon for 3 days before I called him. This requires some explanation, because on the surface, 3 days seems like a long time. Vernon was 20 minutes away and called me every few days and brought groceries without being asked, and was, by any ordinary measure, a good son. I was not afraid of the conversation. What I needed, before I had it, was to be clear about what each possible answer would mean to me going forward. Because I have found over 8 decades that walking into a difficult conversation without having done that work first leads to emotional responses when what the situation requires is a considered one. The possibilities were 3. First, Vernon had known about the obituary and said nothing, which would be one kind of failure. Second, Vernon had known about the estate pressure Pamela had been applying and said nothing, which would be a smaller but still real failure. Third, Vernon had known about neither, which would mean something different. Not a relief exactly, because the central facts did not change regardless, but different in what I chose to do with our relationship afterward. I needed to know what I thought about each of those possibilities before I heard his voice, so that what I said to him would be considered rather than reactive. He came over instead of calling, which is how Vernon handles things when he senses something is serious. I had been careful not to indicate the full nature of what I needed to discuss. I said only that I had something I needed to talk through with him, and he arrived 40 minutes after I called in his work clothes, which told me he had come straight from a job site. He had a look on his face when he got out of the truck, standing in the driveway for a moment before he came to the door, that told me his own thinking had been happening in parallel to mine for some time. I showed him the obituary across the kitchen table. I placed it in front of him and watched his face while he read it. He did not know. I am certain of that. The shock was the unmanaged kind. The kind that cannot be performed. That belongs specifically to someone who has been careful not to ask certain questions and is now discovering what those questions would have answered. He sat there with the paper in his hands for a long time and said nothing at all. "Did you know Pamela was applying pressure about the estate?" I asked. That was the question I needed answered more than the other one. He was quiet for another moment. Then, she mentioned the land in the spring, said it needed to be dealt with. I told her to let it alone. He put the paper down on the table. I didn't ask about it after that. There it was. He had known the pressure was building, had told her to step back from it, and had then turned away from it, had trusted that she would listen, which was the failure of a man who has always assumed that the women in his family will manage the difficult things, and generally do. He had not created this situation. He had not helped prevent it by staying quiet. That was not malice. It was the specific failure of someone who mistakes absence from a conflict for neutrality in it. I looked at my son across the kitchen table and saw a man who was genuinely sorry in the way of someone who does not yet have adequate language for what he should have done. I told him what Leonard was handling and that he didn't need to do anything except stay out of the legal proceedings while they proceeded. He nodded. He finished his coffee. On his way out, he brought in the paper bags he had left in the truck bed without saying he was going to do that, which is how Vernon expresses things he cannot find words for. I watched him drive off Oleander and thought about what I had decided. By the second week, I had read the obituary 5 times. This is not unusual behavior for someone in my position. When a document is central to a legal matter, you read it until you have internalized it completely, until nothing in it can produce a reaction in you that you haven't already accounted for. The 5th reading I did at my desk with my clerk's glasses on, working through it the way I used to work through a suspicious probate filing. Looking at the structure, the word choices, the selection of what to include and what to omit, and what each omission was designed to accomplish. I have always known how to read a document. The photograph was a deliberate choice. Pamela had dozens of photographs of me from recent years. She organized the family holidays. She was meticulous about documentation. She took pictures at every occasion and kept them in a way that would have made any county records office envious. She chose the 2020 Christmas photograph because it was the most dignified and therefore the most convincing. A flattering obituary photograph reads as genuine. A poor one invites questions. She had thought about this. The language had been written by someone who did not know me well and had been given a set of basic facts to work with. A devoted mother and faithful member of her community. She is remembered for her decades of dedicated service and her quiet generosity. These phrases are not wrong, exactly. They are simply the phrases that belong to a form, the form of an obituary, rather than to a specific person. Anyone who had known me for more than 6 months would have written something more specific. The blandness was a tell. The list of survivors was the most structurally revealing element. Pamela had listed herself and Douglas and their 2 children. She had not listed Vernon. I had thought about this omission at length, and I had arrived at 2 possible explanations that I did not think were mutually exclusive. The first, she expected Vernon to be manageable, assumed he would accept a quiet correction later, and felt his inclusion would complicate a circle she wanted to keep small. The second, Vernon called me every few days and brought groceries and was the kind of son who might notice things if he were put on alert, and she was managing her exposure. Both of those things can be true at once, and I believed both of them were. The absence of any funeral arrangements was the obituary's structural weakness. She had been focused on the legal mechanics, the downstream probate petition, the bank inquiry, and had not thought carefully enough about what the document needed to look like in a social context. Paulette Sims had noticed. 3 other women from the online group had been independently troubled by it and had been discussing it for several days before Paulette decided to act. The absence of a service, a funeral home, a place to send flowers. These are the things that real grief produces, almost automatically. The absence of them signals that someone was thinking about a different set of outcomes. I wrote 3 columns in the folder on a fresh sheet: what the obituary stated, what it omitted, and what each omission was designed to prevent. The 3rd column was the longest. I clipped it in sequence behind the legal correspondence and the call log and the record of the bank notification. Leonard's letter to the Augusta firm went out on a Friday. By the following Wednesday, the probate petition had been withdrawn. The Augusta attorney, Leonard told me, had apparently not been fully informed of the circumstances when she was retained, meaning Pamela had not explained to her own lawyer that the death certificate she was relying on did not exist because the deceased was currently living on Oleander Street in Macon, Georgia, making herself a 2nd cup of coffee every morning and watering her tomato plants. Leonard used the word precipitously to describe how quickly the withdrawal came through, which in his vocabulary means the attorney had called her client, and the conversation had not been easy. The bank was more straightforward. I went in person with my driver's license, my Social Security card, and a letter from Leonard confirming that no transfer or account modification of any kind had been authorized by me. The branch manager, a young woman named Priscilla, who was professionally careful not to show anything on her face, processed my verification and noted it in the account record with the kind of thoroughness that told me she had seen something like this before and did not enjoy it. She said everything was in order. I said I expected it would remain so. We understood each other. The land in Bibb County required more steps. Leonard filed a formal objection to the withdrawn petition and attached copies of my current identification, a notarized affidavit from me attesting that I was living and that the obituary was fraudulent and that no transfer of the property had been authorized by me at any point. The Bibb County Probate Court processed the objection in 2 weeks. The 4.3 acres remained in the transfer on death arrangement as Darnell had originally designated it, transferred to me upon his death, passing to Vernon and Pamela in equal shares upon mine on the schedule that nature determines and not the schedule that impatience prefers. Everything Darnell had set up was restored to its correct state, with a full record of the fraud attempt attached and accessible to anyone who pulled the file. Leonard asked me, in our meeting to review the final filings, whether I wanted to discuss Pamela's legal exposure. He laid out the options without directing me toward any of them, which is how he operates when the question is a genuinely complicated one. I thought about it carefully. Filing a fraudulent document with a probate court is serious. Pursuing that seriously would require me to decide how far I was willing to take it, and at what cost to what remained of my family's ability to be in the same room together in the future. I thought about Pamela at 30, arriving at holidays with everything organized and matched, wanting things to look a particular way and working hard to make them look that way. I thought about whether that quality extended 30 years further and aimed at a problem she had decided needed handling, produced a monster, or simply produced a person who had made a very bad calculation and not thought through what it would cost. I want the record to be accurate, I said. It is accurate. That's sufficient. I did not speak to Pamela directly at any point during the legal proceedings. This was not an impulsive decision. I had thought through what a direct conversation with Pamela would accomplish versus what it would cost, and the math was not favorable to having it. Pamela argues the way she manages everything else, by controlling the framing until the other person finds themselves defending their position inside her version of events. I had watched her do this since she was a teenager, first with small arguments, and later with the more sophisticated versions available to an intelligent adult woman who has spent decades perfecting the technique. I was not going to give her a conversation to manage. Everything went through Leonard. Leonard communicated first with the Augusta attorney, then directly with Douglas when the Augusta attorney withdrew from the matter. Douglas, who in my assessment had not been kept as fully informed as he later claimed, sent a message through Leonard indicating that the family was hoping to find a path forward that preserved the relationships involved. Leonard relayed this to me. I did not respond through Leonard. I told him to let the record speak for itself, which it was doing clearly and would continue to do. In the 3rd week, a message came through Douglas directly, not through attorneys, which was probably not the most advisable approach. But Douglas has money and is accustomed to making complicated things manageable with the right phone call. The message said that Pamela understood the situation had been handled improperly and that she had acted out of concern for the family's long-term security, and that she hoped the matter could be approached with mutual understanding. It was not an apology. It was worded specifically to avoid being one. The kind of language that gestures toward accountability without creating any, which I have read in one form or another 10,000 times across 34 years of official documents. I noted it in the folder. I did not respond. Odessa came for lunch on Thursday, the first Thursday since I had called her alive, and she brought a container of her chicken and rice that she makes with the bay leaves from the pot on her windowsill, a recipe her mother gave her in 1968 and that she has not materially altered since. She sat at my kitchen table and we ate and talked about her granddaughter's college acceptance and the re-roofing project at Second Baptist and the new coffee shop that had opened on Cherry Street and whether it was any good. Ordinary things. The folder was in the spare room. We did not discuss the folder. She came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and she has not missed one since. Acted out of concern for the family's long-term security. That is what Douglas sent, on Pamela's behalf, after she filed that paperwork. No apology. A legal hedge with a warm face on it. Nadine read it, noted it, put it in the folder. What would you have done with that message if it had been sent to you? Vernon came by on a Saturday morning in late September and asked if I wanted to walk the Cherry Street Farmers Market with him. The market ran from April through October in the parking lot behind the old tobacco warehouse, and I had been going on Saturday mornings since it opened. I liked walking it when the tables were full and the heat of the day hadn't settled yet, when the vendors were still arranging things and the smell of cut flowers and kettle corn was cleanest. Vernon had never offered to come with me before. He was a man who expressed care through practical things, groceries, gutters, showing up when something needed doing, not particularly through companionable Saturday morning walks. I understood that the offer was the thing he had instead of an apology. We walked for an hour. I bought Vidalia onions from a man who had been coming to that market since its second year, and a jar of sourwood honey from a woman whose family kept bees outside of Forsyth. Vernon carried the bag without being asked and talked about the job he was currently working. A kitchen renovation in a 1940s house on Forsyth Street, where the original cabinetry was being refaced with poplar so the grain would read right with the restored hardware. He talked about the wood the way I talked about documents, with the precision of someone for whom the specific details are the whole point, not the decoration around it. I noticed, walking next to him, that Vernon and I are similar in a way that Pamela and I have never quite been. We are both people who prefer the concrete and specific, who trust things that can be measured and verified, who do not have much use for the management of appearances. Pamela got that quality from somewhere in the family's history, but she did not get it from me, and she did not get it from Darnell, who was as plain-spoken as a man could be. Whatever she had done with it across 54 years was her own. Standing at the honey table with the morning still cool and the smell of fresh ground coffee drifting from the stand 2 tables over, I decided what I thought about Vernon. He had stayed quiet when he should have asked questions. He had trusted that his sister would honor a boundary he had set verbally, and then turned away from it. That was a failure. It was not the same failure as Pamela's, but it was a failure, and I was not going to pretend it wasn't simply because I loved him and because he was standing beside me carrying my onions. I bought the honey. We walked back to the truck, and on the way he stopped at a table selling dried gourds and bird feeders made from them, which is not something I had any use for. But he looked at them with the evaluating attention of a man who thinks about how things are made, turning one over in his hands to look at the seam where the wire was attached. He put it back down, and we kept walking. He stayed for coffee when we got to Oleander Street, and he was good company, easy and unhurried in the way he is when nothing is being asked of him. And he drove home without making a speech about anything, which was the appropriate choice and one I appreciated. Some things are better left to accumulate on their own, in their own time, the way a record builds not through declarations, but through the patient addition of one dated entry after another. The legal work took another 6 weeks to complete fully. Leonard was thorough in a way I appreciated specifically because I recognized it. Not just correcting the filings, but creating a record that made the corrections permanent and permanently traceable. Every document that had been irregularly filed was accounted for. Every petition that had been fraudulently initiated was objected to, withdrawn formally, and annotated with the cause of the withdrawal. Any future search of those records would produce not just the corrected state of affairs, but the full history of what had been attempted and how it had been addressed. There is a satisfaction in this kind of work that is difficult to convey to someone who hasn't done it for most of their life. It is not the satisfaction of winning something. It is not even the satisfaction of being right, though being right is part of it. It is the satisfaction of accuracy, of the record being, at the conclusion of the process, correct. I had spent 34 years in that specific pursuit, making sure that the official documents of Bibb County accurately reflected what was actually true. Deeds should say who owned a property. Death certificates should belong only to people who had actually died. I had not expected, when I retired in 2007, that the last significant act of record-keeping in my career would be on my own behalf. There was a moment somewhere in the middle of the 6th week when I was sitting at the gray desk reviewing a draft of Leonard's final correspondence, and I realized that I was doing the work the same way I had always done it. Not quickly, not with any drama, but with the specific patience of someone who has learned that a record built in a hurry is a record with gaps, and gaps are what the other side looks for when they need a way back in. I had built this record without gaps. Everything was dated, everything was cross-referenced, every phone call was logged, every document was numbered, every step in the correction was annotated with the date it was completed and the name of the person who completed it. When I closed the folder at the end of the 6th week, I closed it the way I used to close a completed county file, with the knowledge that anyone who opened it would find exactly what they needed, in exactly the order they needed to find it, and that nothing in it could be disputed or undone. Odessa came on Thursday, as she had been doing, and 1 week we finally talked about the 9 days directly. Not the legal proceedings, we had touched on those enough, but the 9 days themselves, what they had felt like from inside them. She said grief of that kind compressed time in a way that was difficult to describe. All of the 53 years arriving at once, everything she remembered, insisting on being remembered simultaneously, because the mind, confronted with permanent loss, tries to hold everything before the forgetting can begin. She had been in the middle of that for 9 days. While you were in the middle of that, I said, I was making a list. She looked at me across the kitchen table, and then she laughed. Not a polite laugh, the full one, the one I have known since 1971 that starts somewhere in her chest and is entirely genuine. Of course you were, she said. Of course you were, Nadine. Of course that is exactly what you were doing. In October, Leonard had the final document ready for my signature. An affidavit summarizing the fraudulent filings, the formal corrections made, and confirming that no unauthorized transfers had been completed. He called it the closing record, which is the phrase he uses when a matter has been properly resolved, meaning everything that needed to be addressed has been addressed, documented, and filed in the appropriate location where it will remain accessible for as long as records are maintained. I went to his office on a Tuesday morning and read the affidavit carefully, all 4 pages, which Leonard expected and for which he waited without comment, refilling his coffee from the carafe on the credenza without interrupting me. I signed it with the pen I have used for legal documents since Darnell died, a Sheffer ballpoint that was his, and that writes with enough pressure to produce a clean second copy on carbonless paper. Is there anything else you want to consider pursuing? he asked. It was his way of asking whether I intended to take the fraud question further, to pursue Pamela's legal exposure directly, rather than simply correcting the record. I had been thinking about that question across the 6 weeks of the legal work. I thought about Pamela at 23, showing up to family events with everything coordinated, working hard to make things look a particular way. I thought about what it costs a person to maintain that kind of presentation across 30 years. The effort, the vigilance, the unwillingness to let anything be unmanaged. I thought about where that quality leads when the thing it encounters is an obstacle it has decided to remove. I thought about the 20 years of Christmas cards with the coordinated photographs, the care she had put into those year after year, and about the fact that the same care had gone into the obituary, the same deliberate attention to presentation, the same underlying conviction that if something looked right, it would function right. She had miscalculated on the obituary. She had focused on the legal mechanics and not thought carefully enough about whether the document itself would hold up to scrutiny from the people who knew me. That was her error, not the impulse. She had been managing the presentation of things her whole life and had never been caught out before. Just the execution. At the one moment when the execution most needed to be flawless. The record is accurate, I said. That's what I need. Leonard understood. He has practiced family and estate law for 30 years. He knew that the probate court now had Pamela's name attached to a formally withdrawn fraudulent petition, that the bank had a notation in my account, that the Augusta attorney knew exactly what she had nearly been party to, that Pamela would know the record existed and would know that anyone who looked would find it. The record was itself a consequence, quiet, permanent, and not going anywhere. That was sufficient. I drove home on Riverside Drive instead of the highway because October in Macon has a specific quality of light, low and gold and coming sideways through the pecan trees. And I was in no particular hurry to be anywhere except where I already was. October finished quietly. Vernon came twice, once with groceries, and once to clean the gutters, which he did without announcing he was going to do it, and which genuinely needed doing. He stayed for coffee both times. We talked about his work, about the restored cabinetry on Forsyth Street that the homeowners had apparently loved, about a problem with the tile in a bathroom renovation he was starting on the north side. We did not discuss Pamela. I did not ask what he was doing with regard to his sister, and he did not offer the information, which was the right arrangement for the moment. He was building a different kind of record with me in his own way. Coffee visits, gutters, groceries, and I was willing to receive it. The Tuesday quilting group at Second Baptist met in the fellowship hall from 9 to 11. I had walked past that room dozens of times across the years and had only occasionally stopped to look through the door. It was a room full of women who ranged in age from their late 50s to their mid-80s, with the specific focused quiet of people engaged in work that requires attention and the specific periodic laughter of people who have been meeting weekly for long enough to know each other past the point of formality. Odessa had been going for 2 years. I went on the first Tuesday of November, told myself I was only going to observe, and left 2 hours later, having committed to a pattern and borrowed a pair of scissors that were better than the ones I owned. I had been thinking about the spare room. For 11 years since Darnell died, it had been half home office and half storage. The gray desk, his boxes of books I hadn't been able to move, the sewing machine I used twice a year at most. I had been thinking about reorganizing it, not eliminating the desk. The desk had been in that room for 17 years, and I was not sentimental about furniture in general, but I was specifically sentimental about that desk. But the boxes of books could be sorted. The shelves could be cleared. There was enough room, if I moved things, for the sewing machine to be accessible rather than buried. And if the sewing machine was accessible, I would use it more than twice a year. And if I used it more than twice a year, I might eventually finish something that was worth keeping. I had made a quilt in 1983, a double wedding ring pattern in blues and greens, worked on it for 8 months, and finished it properly with a bound edge. Pamela had it, or had had it at some point. I found when I tried to feel something about that I mostly felt indifferent, and the indifference felt clean rather than hollow, which told me something. I thought I might like to make another one. Something in the warm colors, something for the spare room, something that would be in that room because I made it and put it there, because I decided that was where it belonged. It is November. The light on Oleander Street in November comes in low and pale through the kitchen window in the mornings, cleaner than October's prettiness, more honest about what the season is. I have watched November come to this street for 38 years, and I know what it looks like from every room in the house. I made coffee before 7, same as I have made it for 38 years. Same drip machine. Same brown ceramic mug with the small chip on the rim that the county clerk's office gave me when I retired in 2007, which has required careful handling for 17 years and which I have no intention of replacing. The coffee was good. Outside, Mr. Crittenden Hayes's dog, Senator, was conducting his morning investigation of the leaves accumulated at the edge of the driveway, which he does every morning with the same thoroughness and the same ultimate satisfaction. The folder is in the filing cabinet in the spare room between house, insurance, and Darnell, estate, settled. I labeled the tab Nadine Brewer, Probate Correction, 2024, in my block clerk's letters. It is a complete record. The obituary is inside it, the call log is inside it, the legal correspondence from Leonard, the bank verification, the notarized affidavit, the formal record of the probate court correction, all of it in order, dated, nothing missing. I do not discard documents that belong to an official record. I never have. The folder will stay in that cabinet for as long as I need it to, and after that it will pass to Vernon along with everything else, and he can decide what to do with it. Odessa will be here at noon. She has been coming every Thursday since that first phone call, without either of us formally arranging it. She simply began coming, and I began expecting her, and the arrangement has held for months now. She is bringing the last of her fall muscadine preserves, which she puts up every September in the small ball jars with the gold lids, and which are better than anything I have found in a store across 80 years of looking. I made biscuit dough last night and left it in the refrigerator overnight, which is the only way I make biscuits now because the overnight rest improves the texture considerably. When Darnell was alive, he could never understand why I wouldn't just make them the morning of. I never fully explained that some things are better when you give them time. I have always known how to read a document. I knew what that obituary was from the second time I read it. Not a statement of fact, but a first step in a sequence. A document designed to initiate other documents, to move things. I read it correctly. I gave it to Leonard. I built the folder. I let the record correct itself through the proper channels, which is how correction works when you know the system and you have the patience to use it. The biscuits need to go in the oven at 11:30. It is not yet 8. The morning is long and entirely mine, and Odessa will be here in 4 hours, and that is enough. Nadine didn't make a scene, didn't demand an apology, didn't wait for Pamela to understand what she'd done. She built a folder, corrected the record, and went back to her kitchen. Me? I would have done the same. Though I suspect I'd have made Leonard write that letter with a good deal more edge in it. If Nadine's story stayed with you, Leave her name in the comments. She earned it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this channel runs on stories like hers. Don't miss the next one.